join us today. And this is Rick Grantham's session, Making Informed Decisions, Guidelines for Creating an Effective Dashboard. This webinar series is brought to you in partnership with Excel TV and features 4 back-to-back sessions presented by Excel experts and hosts of Excel TV. My name is Johan Brattos. I am the virtual chapter leader of Excel BI Virtual Chapter, and I have a few quick introduction slides before I hand over the reins to Rick Grantham. He will speak for 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll move on to a Q&A where you can ask him any questions that you may have. Next slide, please. If you require technical assistance, please type your questions into the question pane located on the right side of your screen, and someone will assist you. This question pane is also where you may ask any questions throughout the presentation. Feel free to enter the questions at any time, and once we get to the Q&A portion of the session, I'll read your questions aloud to the speaker. And if we run out of time before all the questions are answered, we'll send them over to Rick so he can reply to you afterwards. You are able to zoom in on the presentation content by using the Zoom button located on the top of the presentation window. And please note that there will be a short evaluation at the end of the session. Your feedback is very important to us, so please take a moment to complete it. It will appear in your web browser. Next slide, please. Today's webinar series is brought to you in partnership with Excel TV and the Excel BI Virtual Chapter. Excel TV is a live broadcast where Excel and analytics are discussed in a casual format. Join the host for topics, tips, and news related to Excel every other Tuesday at excel.tv. The Excel BI Virtual Chapter features sessions on all things Excel business intelligence related, including advanced predictive and prescriptive analytics topics. And join us as soon as this Thursday for Devi Night session using Power BI parameters and templates. You can register online at excelbivc.sequelpass.org. Next slide, please. Rick is the MC of Excel TV and the Director of Business Intelligence Services at FIU's American Consulting. Rick combines TDWI certification in Business Intelligence Leadership and Management, a 6 Sigma Black Belt certification, and 20 years of executive/director level leadership. He started his analytics and reporting career as a credit risk modeler and a financial analyst for Citibank in 1994. He gained extensive experience in process improvement and earned a 6 Sigma Black Belt in 2006. Next slide. And you can follow Rick on these social media channels. Next slide. And right about now, I should hand you over to Rick Grantham. Please take it ahead.
Hello, everyone. Hey, and thank you for that, Johan. I appreciate it. Just so everyone knows, I'm in Northeast Florida, and it's a bit stormy here. So if we end up losing power, we'll figure that out. But that is a risk here. So first off, before we get too deep into this, I want to back up just a little bit and to talk about this slide a bit. You might say 20 years experience in BI. Rick, has BI really been around that long? I mean, Excel's only been around a little bit longer than that, maybe 30 years or so. And so I was around in the early days of Cognos reports, the early days, Crystal reports and Cognos Impromptu. And the reason I bring all of that up is I was doing this before there were books written on it. And I've done it just about every way wrong that you can possibly do it without getting fired. So the goal of this is to share some of that knowledge, to share with you some of the pitfalls, to share with you where some of the ditches are so that you don't fall in them as you're going through some of this stuff maybe for the 1st or 10th time. So that's the goal of what we're trying to accomplish here. What we're going to talk through today is making informed decisions, guidelines for creating effective dashboards. So this isn't necessarily an Excel talk, although it is partially an Excel talk. The deepest we'll get into Excel is how to build mockups in Excel so that if you're going to create basically dashboards in pretty much any tool, any of the big BI vendors, you have a good process, a step-by-step process that you could go through from the very first time that an executive knocks on your door until it's time to do delivery. So with that, we will, I have probably about 40 minutes of conversation here, and then we'll open that up for questions at the very end. So first off, this isn't a deep technical session. This is intended for business leaders and analysts to walk you through a process of how you go about gathering requirements, doing your mock-ups, and what's the best way to do this. You're going to learn best approaches for tackling the most visible of the analytics, the dashboard, and we're going to discuss step by step the best way to scope your dashboard, how to elicit metrics, when should you do that, and how to document your query mockups and things of that nature. So this is really less theoretical and more of a step-by-step process, something that you could take and kind of move that into whatever business intelligence tool that you're using. So the agenda, here's the things we're going to go through, and guess what? These are the steps. So we're going to determine data scope. We're going to talk about what that is and how do you determine data scope. How do you do that for your organization? We're going to talk about whiteboarding your dashboards. We'll talk about the query mockup. What do you hand off to the data warehouse guy, to the database guy or database person? And what's the best way to mock that up within Excel? We'll talk about Excel prototyping. How do you determine, or what's a kind of a best practice and what's the best time in the process to do a prototype? We'll talk about mockups, and then we'll talk about tools quickly, and we'll do a wrap-up. So first off, here's a real scenario. Scenario is your executive right now is possibly listening to something like this. He's in a webinar or something, and let's say he just watched 4 back-to-back Excel and analytics webinars. Right? By the way, loved Rick. Thought Rick was awesome. And saw some cool metrics. He listened to Jordan in the previous hour and heard about best ways to do dashboards and the best way to set up your spreadsheet models, etc. Hey, and your executive knows that you have some reporting tools, knows that you have either Power BI or you have some sort of business objects tool, or that you have some tools. And now they want to talk with you. So they want to talk with you about, they want you to build some dashboards, and they want you to build some visualizations, and they're bringing you into their office. So the question is, what do you do? What's your first step? What would most people do in this situation where an executive calls them into their office and says, hey, I hear you got some tools. What can you build for me? What does that conversation usually go like? Well, here's what happens in most situations, and I've been at PASS and several other kind of business intelligence conferences to where we've whiteboarded this out. And as we've whiteboarded it out, we've asked the audience, what would most people do in this situation? And here are the answers that come out. Is they ask, most time they ask the executive, hey, what do you want? So basically they show up with a blank piece of paper, like I did for however many years, show up with a blank piece of paper and say, okay, so you want some dashboards? What do you want? And getting ready to write requirements. We'd call that requirement gathering. But basically, and then the executive usually answers and says, okay, well then what do you have? And then from there you usually get into some sort of a tool demo or something of that nature. But basically the meeting's over. And here's the problem with that sort of a scenario. You walked in reactive. You walked in with a blank piece of paper, acting like you didn't know what was going on, or that you didn't have a real grasp of how to lead an executive through a proper process, right? What's a right process to be able to gather the requirements, or what's the right process to be able to let the executive or put them at ease that you know what you're doing and that you've been down this road before. Well, here's something else that people do, right? Instead of being reactive, they will get artistic. They can't, there's not an IT person alive, or a consultant for that matter, who can't wait to get a marker in their hands, right? They can't wait for a whiteboard. They can't wait to start, drawing out pie charts and everything else, and get a whiteboard going and markers going. So they break out the markers and the whiteboards. They often do it with very little knowledge of the data that's available. So it's almost a wish list where you're sitting there with the executive and you're drawing out what would be really great to have, only to go back to your desk and over the next 2 weeks find out that a good portion of that was impossible because the data is very difficult to get to. So these are some of the things that start to get you in trouble then. So Let's talk about what should you do. Well, as you walk through the steps, the very first thing is even before you show up to the executive's door, before you even walk into their office, resist the urge to start drawing. Don't even go down that path. You need to figure out what sort of data you have available first, and figure out what sort of content makes the most sense so that you're walking into your executive's office informed. Right, this is going to save you a ton of time later. It's going to save you a bit of embarrassment later where you've drawn out dashboards and for data that's not even available. So here's some items to consider on that. What metrics does the executive want to track? What are the measures? And we'll talk through as we go through this. We'll bring up some real examples of what that looks like. How do you figure that out, Rick? That's just a bullet point, but what does that really look in real life? What does the executive want to slice and dice in the metrics, and how do you figure that out before you've ever walked into the office? So we'll chat through that. What are the dimensions? I'll throw out some of the BI terms. This is an Excel BI conference that everybody kind of knows what measures and dimensions are, but basically what's the what's the math and the dimensions, the categories of things you slice and dice those measures by. And can the executive define how these should be calculated? Now, I know some very high-level keynote speakers at business intelligence conferences that will go in and say, hey, if the executive cannot define how things should be calculated, the consultants won't even do business with them because it's that important. It's that important that these need to be able to be calculated. Now, I'm assuming for the sake of this conversation that most of you are like me and we can't afford to throw away work. And so we'll walk through a process of how you go about doing that whenever your executive isn't ready to go down that path. And next, what system holds each piece of data? Is the system easily accessible or not? So part of determining what sort of data is going to be brought into the dashboard to begin with is how accessible the data is. Is it available in your data warehouse today, or is it in some cloud system that's difficult to get access to? So how do you determine data scope? Rick, that was real nice. That was some bullet points, but how do you actually go about doing this? What does a spreadsheet look like? What's kind of the best practices around figuring that out? So let's show you an example of what I use. So this is an example of data scope. Now, as we walk through this today, I want to talk about two different types of dashboards, right? I want to talk about a strategic dashboard, and I want to talk about an operational dashboard, and I'm going to tell you how to identify which one it is that you're working on. But understanding this difference between operational and strategic is important. And you'll see I even have two tabs here, right? I have a strategic tab of the sort of things that I would look for, and if it's an operational dashboard, the sorts of things I would look for. So let's make this a little bit larger, and I'll make this all available on the Excel TV website after this talk. So on the strategic side, so what is a strategic dashboard? A strategic dashboard is typically defined as almost a tops-down approach, right? You're aligning to the annual report. You're aligning with strategic direction that the organization wants to go in. And in this case, we'll use the HR department, the Human Resources Department. How are they aligned with the direction that the corporation is going? Well, in a strategic dashboard, there's a number of things that I would look at, right? I would look at, in this case, we'll say, what are some operational KPIs and some business KPIs, and those are aligned here. And we'll talk about audit reports as well. Usually, anytime that you have a dashboard, there are audit reports associated with that, so we'll walk through that as well. Now, over on the left-hand side, you'll see we have a business name. These are business names of the measures and the dimensions that are typically in a dashboard. Realize a lot of this you can do before you ever walk into the executive's office, right? You have an idea of the business name, of the sorts of things that they're looking for. You can get an idea of what sort of system that they're in. Are they in a recruiting system, an e-recruiting system? Or are they in an HC? An HR, HCM system, or if you don't know what system they're in. And in some instances, you're even able to get the technical field name. And some of this you're able to do before you ever walk into the executive's office, right? There's prep work, so you walk in acting like you know what you're talking about. Also additional logic, so as you're talking with the executive then, you're walking through really data scope. Here's the sorts of data that's available before we ever get to the whiteboarding session. Here's the things that are easy to get to, here's the things that are difficult to get to. So usually as you end up your first session with the executive, you're going back and you're starting to fill in what are the additional logic, what are the additional dependencies. So this spreadsheet will be made available after the webinar. Well, there's also operational dashboards, and the great thing about operational dashboards is you have a ton more information that you're able to walk into the executive's office with, right? Because operational dashboards are usually defined by there are a number of reports that already exist out in the organization that are being rolled up into a dashboard, right? So it's not a tops-down approach, it's really a bottoms-up approach. So in that case, if you already have tons of reports, then you already have a pretty good idea of what you need to roll up, right? So there's no reason that you can't already roll report number 1 through report number whatever these reports are. And here these X's just identify where there's a cross-section between the business name of a piece of data and the reports that they're in. So what that means is I'm able to see exactly which reports, exactly which fields are on which reports, and which ones are likely to make good candidates that the executive is looking at for measures and dimensions that would likely go into my dashboard. I'm able to walk in and start to be a bit prescriptive and walk in with my details and have an idea of what have an idea of what the executive wants. Again, on the right-hand side, you have additional logic and dependencies, etc. So this is a good amount of work and effort that you can put in before you ever walk into the executive's office with a blank piece of paper and say, so what do you want? So we're going to talk a bit more about an operational strategic dashboard and some of the gotchas associated with that as the webinar continues. So you might say to yourself, well, Rick, yeah, that's all great, but there's no way my executive is going to have patience for that, right, to walk through a big data scoping project like that. And that makes sense, right? Not every executive is. And in those cases, there is a lower tech option, right? They're not all going to have the patience for that. So in that case, do come to the meeting prepared, right? Discuss and research any available data elements there are prior to the workshop and call this a workshop. Go in and facilitate this. Bring the available data metrics with you to the whiteboarding session. And what I do is I paste the available data on the wall right next to the whiteboard for whenever we go to the whiteboard, so that we don't get into a session of whiteboarding out things that aren't available. So let's talk about whiteboarding. So here are some things to consider before you break out the markers. There's a strategic dashboard, which I like to call Revolution, right? This is usually an executive comes in and they want to change the entire system. They want a tops-down approach, and the executive, it usually takes a strong analytic executive to come in and do this, right? I find that strategic dashboards, although they are perfect in theory, I like how clean the theory is. It's really only about 10 to 20% of the time that strategic dashboards, that I'm asked to build strategic dashboards. But I consider these to be kind of a revolution, right? It's a very big tops-down approach. Metrics cascade from one dashboard to the next, down to diagnostic reports, from a corporate vision all the way down to, what are the lowest managers measuring. Then there are operational dashboards, which I consider not to be revolution, but evolution, right? Your existing reports are evolving into a dashboard. So things tend to start out with reports. Dashboards end up evolving from your existing reports. So what does that look like kind of graphically, right? So this is a tops-down approach, right? And I'm using SQL Server as an example here, but enter your database that you like here. All right, this could be Oracle, et cetera, or wherever your data warehouse or wherever your systems are. And what would typically happen in this sort of a scenario is I would walk into these sorts of meetings. If I'm having a meeting with, we'll say, the HR executive, I would walk in with a copy of the annual report, right? And in this scenario, say the HCM executive, the HR executive, human resources executive, I would walk in with a copy of the annual report. I would already have highlighted the things in the annual report that I pulled off the web, which, by the way, that executive probably hasn't even seen. Things that are HR related. Now, these are sometimes difficult to find, right, in the annual report. But you'll see them as things like, we'll say if you're an oil company, you'll see things like, we're concerned about our ability to renegotiate with the union, or there is a risk in Asia of competitors stealing our talent, heavily recruiting our talent. And you'll hear things like that, and you'll see things like that in the annual report. Those are the sorts of things then that your HR department in a tops-down approach like this should start to rally behind, right? The inability to make that linkage between, we'll say in this case, HR and the direction that the organization is going is the reason that departments like HR tend to get outsourced, right? Or even sometimes accounting tends to get outsourced because that linkage isn't clear and isn't made. So in these sort of instances, often I'll walk in with the annual report and we will see what are the 3 or 4 things in there that align them with the strategic direction that the CEO and the organization is going. So this tends to be your top KPIs here. And then there tends to be 3 or 4 sort of functional areas. And we'll use the example of human resources again, and we'll say, okay, well, there's an onboarding of employees, there's a management of employees, and then there's kind of an offboarding and et cetera of employees. So even though the HCM lead may have 15 direct reports, you can kind of broadly put those into 3 or 4 functional areas. So here's the thing. The KPI on the supporting dashboard and a true strategic dashboard does not exist unless it supports the direction that the executive is going, right? So it's actually KPI 1.1, 2.1, 3.1, et cetera, because they're all in support of the direction that the executive is going. And you'll see a word down here in reports, and these are not operational reports, these are diagnostic reports. And what I mean by that is they exist only because they answer a question as to why a KPI was missed. So think about this then, right? If I know what the KPIs are that are going to be in the dashboard, I can walk into an executive's office, and I've done this, walk into an executive's office and say, based on the KPIs that we've selected here and the dimensions, the things that you tend to slice and dice things by, here is a list of 58 potential reports. And it's really your KPIs, right, sliced and diced by your dimensions in various different formats and reports. So basically you're walking in then and you're being prescriptive, right? You're not being reactive, you're being prescriptive and saying, here executive, here's a list of 60 reports that I think makes sense based on the KPIs and strategic direction we're going. Tell me which ones don't apply. That's a very different conversation of tell me which ones don't apply. That's a very different conversation than a very open-ended question like, hey, tell me what reports you want. It's a very different proactive versus reactive discussion. So let's look at the other kind of dashboard, the operational dashboard. Now this tends to happen whenever you have operational reports, and those tend to flow up into operational reports. In this sort of a scenario, which is 80% of the time, do not, I repeat, do not walk in with an annual report, right? This is one of those instances where, after 20 years, there were some instances where I was lucky I didn't get fired. And in those instances are situations where I had to learn that everything is not perfect, right? Everything is not like you'd like it to be, like this previous slide, a strategic dashboard, where you walk in with the annual report and a strategic dashboard is only applicable 15 to 20% of the time, right? If you walk in with an annual report to somebody who has this sort of a mindset, you have a disconnect in the first 5 minutes of the conversation. So understanding your executive or understanding your champion and being able to read whether they are more of a tops down or a bottoms up in their approach to dashboards is critical in getting this first meeting correct. But what I would do in this sort of operational dashboard, right, and when I have an operational leader, is I would bring the reports with me to the whiteboarding session, right? I would start with the existing reports. I would bring those with me along with the spreadsheet that I showed you earlier, and I would bring that into my whiteboarding session and say, okay, well, based on these elements and based on these reports and based on the things that are available, let's start to talk about what bubbles up to a dashboard. And again, this is 80% of the time usually. So what are some of the best practices around whiteboarding? Well, simplicity is key, and we'll get into this in a little bit more detail, and I'll show you some examples of navigation, segmentation, and criteria selection. But here's some of the don'ts, so that's a little bit easier to show you. Pie charts and gauges, if you've been in BI long enough, you know they show very few data points. And I was a gauge guy for a long time. For a long time, that I thought that was BI. You know, that was BI for about 7 years or so, until people came along and told us, hey, that's not the way to do it, and here's why. So to the extent, and so the reason I say that is you'll have several executives that will still equate that to a dashboard. Do not go to that executive and say, hey, Rick Grantham in a webinar told me you're wrong. Right? I don't want to hear that. But there are other ways to do that, and we'll talk about some of the places in more detail on the best way to show simplicity and to show more data in a dashboard at the very end of this presentation. So let's talk through some examples then of whenever I said navigation, segmentation, and criteria selection, what did I mean? So all I've done here is go to Google and I typed in corporate dashboard, right? And I went over to images and we're just going to look at some of the dashboards. And what you'll notice from these, if you're not a dashboarding guru, you'll start to see that there are some themes that come out in dashboards that tend to be done right. And the first one is navigation. And we'll pull this one up just as an example. Corporate dashboard, while there's navigation up here at the top. There's sales, but typically there would be several more in navigation. Let's go to another one here. So that's what I mean by navigation. It's across the top. Typically that's in just about every dashboard. You'll find some way to navigate through those. The second one is segmentation, and you'll see the segmentation here as well, to where it's separated out in some way. And this is particularly important whenever you have selectors. And here's a better example of that. Whenever you have any sort of a selectors like these right here, segmentation becomes much more important so that you know what graphs and what visuals that those graphics are impacting. And then lastly is your criteria selection. Let's scroll down here at the bottom, and you'll see, one moment, there's one with plenty of criteria selection, we'll say here on the left-hand side, where you have both the segmentation here, you have criteria selection on the left-hand side, and this looks to be being around long enough. This is business objects. Looks like it was somebody put a different logo on it. This is a business objects dashboard. Appears to be, and on the left-hand side, you'll see that there's navigation, or excuse me, up top there's navigation. On the left, there's criteria selection, and that there is also within here there are, there's segmentation. But there's another way to do segmentation, and this has really only come out in the last few years. So I'll make this link available afterwards. But there's a guy named Michael Alexander who wrote most of the Excel data visualization books that are out now, except for Jordan Goldmeyer, who's written quite a few as well. But if you're looking at, I don't know, Excel dashboards for dummies or any of those sorts of things, Michael Alexander wrote it, right? Michael Alexander also happens to run a blog called DataPig Technologies. And so we had him on the show, and in the show he talked about quite a bit about the use of white space, and how this is changing quite a bit in dashboards, where there used to be much more of a segmentation was around putting borders and bold borders, etc., so you can segment things that way. But you can actually get much more creative in just using font sizes, real faint lines, font sizes, and font size and different coloring to make your point much more effectively. So the reason I bring this up, and there's a video down here at the bottom that as he's walking through it, so I'll make this available as well. But the point here being is whenever I talk about segmentation, there are modest ways to do this that isn't very in-your-face, 5 separate panes with bold outlines, etc. There are much more subtle, beautiful ways that you can do this. So don't go into this just thinking, this has got to be ugly, it's got to be segmented in that manner. Go back to the PowerPoint. So now you have your query mockup. I always recommend at the end of the query mockup, this wasn't as in vogue 10 years ago as it is now, but always take a picture of the whiteboard after it's done, because usually we compare that later to the mockups as we start to send mockups out. So there's a few steps to the query mockup, and you'll notice I'm separating out here the phrase query mockup from the prototype, and I'm using the word query here. Right, a query mockup is something that I would put in Excel in this example. And remember, we're creating this not necessarily for Excel BI, although that's a possibility. We're creating this for pretty much any business intelligence dashboarding tool, right? So we would create a query mockup, something that we could hand off to the developers, something that we could hand off to the database developers, the data warehouse and the data mart people, so that they have something to start building on. So in addition to, of course, the requirements, typically the first thing I'll send them will be a query mockup. Right? And I developed this in a spreadsheet, and I'll show you an example of that. But typically, this will list the data elements that I need to populate and to be able to support the dashboard. It's the layout, the field names, etc. So in addition to spelling out all of that, I also create dummy data for that, right? To give the developer an idea of what it looks like, and that serves two purposes. Right? It serves the purpose of not only providing detail to the data mart developer, but it also provides me with a data dump, mock data that I can use to start doing my mock-up, to start doing my prototype in Excel. So I'll show you an example of, we'll go through some of the benefits, and I'll show you an example of that. So the benefits is really for two different people. For the dashboard designer, so for me, right, it creates an initial data set, so I can use that for my prototypes. And for the database technician, it provides the context of how the data will need to be formatted for the dashboard. It's particularly important if you're doing OLAP style dashboards. So what are some examples of that? One moment. So here's some examples. So in this case, we're building an HR dashboard. You'll see I'm just using a ran between function here so that it automatically updates anytime that I update it. So more on that later as we get into the prototype. But in this case, what I'm doing is creating a mock-up of what the data looks like. And you'll see not only does this give something for the database developer, in addition to, of course, the requirements that they would need. Not only does this give them something to an idea of sort of the format, et cetera, but also gives me an initial data set to start prototyping. Right? Gives me an idea of the percentages, et cetera. So Excel prototyping and feedback. So now is where you're able to get a bit creative and start breaking out in Excel and building a prototype that you could later build into your dashboarding tool. So the goal here is to transform the whiteboard into an Excel visual. Right? It shouldn't be built out in your dashboard tool yet unless that is Excel BI. The goal here is to take the whiteboard visuals and kind of put it into something that's flexible so that you can email this out to the executives and they can interact with it. So it has to be interactive enough to where they can play with the data, to where they can start to give you feedback on where they want different tabs to be, where they want different selectors to be, things of that nature, but not so in depth to where you're actually building the dashboard. So here's a few tools that you should use to make this happen. Number one, I'd say in any sort of color theory, making sure that your colors go well together. I always recommend Color Brewer. That's colorbrewer2.org. So if you go there, what this allows you to do is it plays with different templates of colors. And so as you pick the template that you like, it then gives you the hex codes where you can take those hex codes and bring those into Excel as you're building out your dashboard. So you end up having something that's very beautiful and looks well together. Next, as you're doing your mock-ups, there are a few YouTube channels that I recommend. Well, one in particular is the Excel Kid. So if you're not familiar with the Excel Kid, I believe he's out of England, I believe. Has a robust dashboard tutorial on how you go about building mock-ups. I have some links here for the introduction, additional functionality, and of course the full dashboard playlist. But some of this functionality I'm going to show you in the next screen or two. So a prototyping example. Here's a prototyping example. Let me make this a little bit bigger for you. Again, this is not a final dashboard, right? This is something that the executive can play with to start to see whether or not, where they want the selectors at, where do they want the tabs at, etc. But there's enough interactivity built in to where they can play a little bit, right? So some of the interactivity would include, here's a recruiting dashboard. Of course, there's an HTML tab, which is just objects creating an HTML in here, but all this HTML is doing is going to the next tab, which is down here. So one of the things that I always do is anything that dashboard is best practice, if you can, to make sure that you have links to the detail, particularly if you think that your end users are going to question the data the moment you put it out. Right? They're going to say, well, I don't have that many employees. A lot of times I'll provide the data to the extent that it doesn't create any security concerns. Right? So I'll have the detail associated with that so there's no question where people are coming from, etc. Let's go back then. We have the recruiting detail, tabs across the top. You'll also notice that in addition to some of the graphics, I have different selectors, etc. So this isn't beautiful like a beautiful dashboard. This is a prototype. So some of the things in here that you'll notice is that in these selectors here, I can select some of the different, we'll say jobs, just as an example. I'll select a different job. I'll select job number 4, and you'll see the data updated. Now, I always have to preface this with the executives and say, hey, this is not real data. All I'm trying to do is give you an idea of how the interactivity would work so that you can have an idea of how things work. Right? So you can have your drop downs of year, etc. And as you select different things, the data kind of updates. So you might say, well, Rick, if this isn't real data, then how are you doing that? How are you providing that interactivity? And here's the way I do that. You'll see behind here, there is this drop-down box feeds into whatever I've selected. It pops out a number. We'll say job 2 here. It pops out the number. That's number 3 in the list. Right? But this is, anytime that anything changes on the spreadsheet, these numbers are going to update. I've just hidden it. Right? I've just hidden it here. So how that's done is through ran between. So you'll see I have a few other formulas here. So I have another tab here for formulas where I have, from the previous step, I have the query mockup. Right? I have the data that's available here. I have some data that assists me in prototyping. And you'll notice in several of these, there are ran between functions. Now, ran between, in this case, give me a random number between. Make sure you can see this here a little better. Well, not much. A random number between 60 and 100 times, some ancillary number here. Right? And what I'm doing, and what this does, is ran between. Any time that a number is updated in the spreadsheet, it does the recalculation. Right? So this is what's driving the graph. So what that means is now, anytime over here that I change this from job 3 to job 4 to job 5, etc., all the graphs update accordingly. Again, this is not to be an end dashboard. It's a quick and dirty way to create a prototype to give some interactivity to your executive as he's starting to play with design ideas and getting past what was whiteboarded, a few weeks earlier, into something that's in Excel and get an idea of this is really how it's going to look. Okay. So next step is to elicit feedback. Now that you've sent this to the executive, you send the prototype to the leadership team. Right? I usually give them a few days to a week. I schedule then a meeting to review the prototype and any sort of design elements. The picture that was taken during the whiteboard session, I bring that with me if I need to. Right? I bring that with me and say, okay, well, based on our design session, based on our whiteboard session, here's the prototype, and based on the management feedback, any sort of alterations. And at this point, you're getting into a feedback loop. Right? You're getting into a feedback loop until leadership signs off. So you're building mock-ups, you're getting feedback. So what do I mean by mock-ups? What's the difference between mock-ups and prototyping? Prototyping to me is something that I'm doing quick and dirty in Excel to give an executive an idea of the look and feel and how the interactivity is going to go. A mock-up is a bit different. Usually I'm building that quickly in a quick dashboarding tool. So let me show you an example of what that could look like in a moment in something called Excelsius. So we'll transform the Excel prototype into a dashboard mock-up. So it's the first step that usually requires deeper technical expertise outside of Excel, right? And often I'll import the query mock-up into the dashboarding tool and realize a lot of this is going on while your database team is still building your connection. So it's still a prototype, right? And we're going to redesign the Excel prototype into a dashboarding tool and allow leadership to test the functionality. So what does that look like? Looks a little something like this. All right, so this is not really connected to real data. This is Excel in the background, but it's a bit more of a, in this case, is a tops-down strategic dashboard. Again, going with the human resources theme, e-recruiting. This is really gives you an idea of what I mean when I say tops-down. So you'll see on the left-hand side, we have KPI categories. These are all around e-recruiting. And you'll notice something happens whenever I click on internal movement, just as an example. The detail, I'm getting an additional level of detail as I go through the dashboard, right? So we have internal movement, we have the trend of internal movement, but I want more detail than that. So we do have supporting KPIs, right? This is cascading. So I have internal movement. So here are the KPIs then, the key performance indicators, the measures that support internal movement. And here, and since KPIs only give you 1 or 2 data points, not a whole lot, to the extent any of these are red, certainly I'm going to want to investigate further, right? We'll say internal hire ratio. Well, I only have 1 data point, but the trend is bad. Let's explore this a little bit further. Well, now there are graphs down here, external hire rate. That gives me what that looks like over time. Do I have a problem with 1 data element, or do I have a problem with a series of data elements, right? And in addition to that, you'll notice on the left-hand side, these are not operational reports, these are diagnostic reports. You'll also notice something else, that the title of the reports, and these are links, by the way. These are dead links at the time. They don't actually go to a report because it's to give an idea. It's a prototype, not a full-on dashboard. But at this time, you'll see these links here, external hire rate by function area. This is something that we were able to do whenever we were first drafting up the reports, right? We said, okay, well, external hire rate, we know that's something you're going to want to look at. Here are 7 potential reports that we think would be good for external hire rate, because we're going to look at it by functional area, by last year, by recruiter, and 3 or 4 other ways that we could look at external hire rate. And the same thing with net hire ratio, same thing with recruiting source breakdown. These all support these graphs, which support the KPIs, which support the direction that HR is going. Now, here's what you'll notice. As I change this to internal movement, not only do the KPIs change, not only do the graphs change, the diagnostic report titles change as well. Internal movements, now it's career path ratio, to support career path ratio, to support this, to support internal movement. So it's an entire tops down. Now, you may say, hey, Rick, that's fine. But my executives are going to want to have more information than that, right? We have diagnostic reports, and yeah, that's great, but my executive likes to play a little bit more. So how can we provide more interactivity in the dashboard without having to necessarily get additional analysts involved? We see I have a tab here called Interactive Visualization. Interactive Visualization, now I can select several different dimensions across the top, or several different ways of slicing the data, and I can start to select metrics. We'll say, in this case, I want to look at offer acceptance rate, and you'll see my x-axis title changed. For my y-axis, I want to look at internal placement rate. See my y-axis change. Z-axis is the size of the bubble in a bubble graph. So let's take a look at that then. Maybe I want the number of offers. You see I start to have some data here now, right? So I start to have something I can play with. Now, you might say, well, Rick, this is 4 ways of slicing the data, and I'd argue with you and say, no, it's actually 5, right? We have 1, 2, 3, 4, and the 5th, which is a little bit faint here, but it says July 2010, which you see whenever you press the play button. August, September, and I'm able to deselect things I'm not interested in, etc. Right? So now I have a little bit more interactivity that I'm able to give an executive, and at the same time they go over to work contract. they could play with the data they're interested in, and get a bit more information to be able to send over to the analysts. Right? So this is an idea of what a prototype starts to look like. This is still not connected to the data warehouse. Right? The tool that I'm using here is something called Excelsius. Right? It was originally built on top of Excel. So it's a big graphical kind of interface with widgets, etc., that sits on top of Excel that was in turn purchased by, I believe, Crystal Reports, which is purchased by Business Objects, which is purchased by SAP. So there's been a long history of consolidation in the BI area. But all this is just an idea of how I can prototype something using the data that I already have in Excel. So to get back to our first slide today, this scenario happens all the time. An executive comes back from a past conference, saw some cool metrics, they know you have some reporting tools, and they call you into the office, and they want to work with you to build some dashboards. What do you do? And I recommend, instead of walking in with a blank piece of paper, that you put yourself in a much stronger position. You put yourself in a much been there, done that position, someone who has credibility if you walk in with a process. And I'd recommend that this process is probably as good as any, where you determine the data scope, then you whiteboard all the way through, knowing exactly when and where the feedback loops are going to happen until you get into final development. So where do you find out more? These are some of the places that I go to on a fairly regular basis. The first thing that executives might say is they say, well, what are other people doing out there in the industry? What are some KPIs that are good for, I don't know, a school board, or K through 12, or a oil company, or enter your industry here. And I recommend people start off at the KPI mega library. First you find out the strategic direction your organization is going in, but then after that, go to KPI mega library, where at least you have a library of key performance indicators that are used in different industries and in different parts of the world. Also recommend colorbrewer2.org, and any of the sort of playlists that I recommend here as well, particularly with the Excel kit. So a few points to take home. Please don't design anything until you've completed a data scoping exercise. This has burned me too many times. Make sure that you've completed the data scoping exercise, that you know of the data that's available before you go in and you start prototyping things that you have to take back later. Also remember, I'm going to provide after this a data element matrix, the spreadsheets that I showed you, to help determine the source of all the data that's required, so that'll be available. If you're also, you need to know if you're doing a strategic dashboard or operational dashboard, and have a pretty clear idea. And the way I've usually talked with executives about that is, hey, there are two different ways to do this. There's revolution and there's evolution. Which one makes the most sense here in the direction that you're heading? Where's your head at here? And I can usually get a pretty clear idea within the first 3 or 4 minutes. And I realize that and understand that before I ever schedule the first meeting. And I certainly use a color wheel to assist with any palettes. So with that, Johan, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Rick. There are no questions so far. So unless there's something popping up right now, I think we'll, oh yes, there's something here. Just thank you so much for the presentation.
All right, thank you.
So let's see now. There's Robert asking, how long does the whole process take on average?
It really depends on the feedback loop, right? For me, this would usually go on for a few weeks just to get through this process. And the process becomes a lot shorter now, depending on what sort of tool you're using, because whenever this process was first going on, there weren't tools that allow for real rapid application development of dashboards. Now there are many tools out there, and I can think of quite a few where you're able to connect directly and start to get some data pretty quick. So it really depends on your access to data and the data you have available. But usually I can fly through this in a few weeks. Usually within 30 days, I like to have something, at least the prototype, up. all the way through that within, I don't want 30 days to go by that I'm there on the ground at a client where I don't have something that they have in their hands and they say, yes, go build this.
Will the presentation be available for viewing later? Yes, it will be. We'll put it on the Excel BI Virtual Chapter YouTube channel. And furthermore, there seems to be a lot of people that are very happy with the presentation, and nothing else. With that on, I think we'll wrap up the Q&A, and just to inform you that Sylvia Juhas is presenting 10 great reasons to use Excel tables in the next 9 minutes. So let's see, just one second, one thing more. Can we get your current Excel example? That was what you were putting on Excel TV, yeah?
Yes, and I have those on Excel TV, and what I'll do after this, Johan, is I'll provide a link to where all of these files are at, along with a write-up of largely what I talked about today.
That should cover everybody, I think. Thank you very much, and thank you everybody for attending. And we'll see you next on Sylvia's session, I think. Thank you.